This is the 100th episode of the Effective Executive podcast and YouTube channel. And this week I want to revisit the whole purpose of why I started into the Effective Executive from Mind Your Noodles, which was a learning experience about neuroscience and how that affects management and organizations and things of that sort, and had a number of experts that were in the first part of what became the Effective Executive. And it's so important from my perspective that people understand what an effective executive entails. And when we look at, first of all, synthetic thinking or systems thinking, we need to define what a system is. And what a system is a set of two or more parts that have relationships that achieve a purpose or a function. And, if you don't have interaction of parts, then you really more have an aggregation, not a system. So a car, for instance, is an interaction of parts that achieves transportation for people. It's not the sum of the parts. And it's one of the hardest things in talking to executives to get them to understand, because oftentimes they think they're systems thinkers or synthetic thinkers, and they're really not. They think they see the big picture, but they're missing important components of it by the way that they have their system set up. And rarely, when you optimize the performance of the individual parts, a worker, a team, a department, does it improve the whole of a system. Yet almost every organization that I've ever worked with focuses so much on individual parts and not the interaction of the parts. And therein lies the problem of why we have very few effective executives. We have more efficient executives. Now, the aim from my perspective, and maybe a visual representation, would be that our aim in operating or looking at an entire system is that we want to not shift just the little pieces in a bell curve. You're always going to have somebody at the top. You're always going to have somebody at the bottom. And if we're just going to focus on the people at the top, that usually is a very small representation of a company. You might have 3 or 4 talented performers in your organization, but if you have 1,000-person organization, making 3 or 4 people perform better isn't going to get you very far. So our aim is to work on the interaction of the parts and shifting the entire bell curve and achievement of purpose. So being an effective executive means improving the interaction of the parts to boost function and to achieve the purpose of that particular system. And you've got to have clarity around purpose in order for the interaction of the parts to boost the function. So this requires trade-offs and sacrifice. So what do I mean by this? Well, with so much focus on talent, what you have, if you're always hiring the best talent, and I'm not against best talent, but it depends on how you define it, often leads you to an organization full of prima donnas. You've got a bunch of people out there singing their own solos, stepping on people, doing stuff in an organization. And so that's really what their aim is. And they say, oh, well, they're such a great individual performer. It doesn't work out because having too many prima donnas doesn't help with the interaction of the parts. So last week I did a video and go back to, I was talking about the Fed, but in essence, talking about some of these same concepts that performance goals are tied to the individual parts and not the interaction. And this is the message I have for executives is that, they have their performance goals that are so individually oriented that it doesn't help with the interaction of the parts and the improvement of the entire system. They are counter them when you reward people for their individual performance without looking at what the system needs. So that's why I'm so focused on when I go into organizations, understanding their customer, because nobody can argue really once you start to listen to customers and what's important to them, and developing what I have in my system or my method as the customer creed, developing a list of things in essence that customers require of your organization. You'll get a whole set of different measures that are customer oriented and not results oriented. And by serving the customer, you therefore get the outcomes that you're looking for. But you don't do this by individual parts and improving those and taking a piece. This is the analytical type of mindset that I talk about in some of my playlists. They're kind of introductory to the effective executive, and you can listen to those. I'll put a link to it at the end, but it's also at the beginning of the video where I talk about analytical versus synthetic type of thinking, where I talk about the being effective versus being efficient. But there's a series of, I think, 4 or 5 videos that go through that are certainly worth listening to. So that's my message in my 100th effective executive episode is get executives to understand that being effective means working on the interaction of parts and not the individual components. I think we can improve a lot of organizations that way. That's what I wanted to cover this week. And remember, there is always a better way.